The Whig Interpretation of History by Herbert Butterfield. Chapter 6. Moral Judgments in History. It is the natural result of the Whig historian's habit of mind and his attitude to history, though it is not a necessary consequence of his actual method, that he should be interested in the promulgation of moral judgments, and should count this as an important part of his office. His preoccupation is not difficult to understand when it is remembered that he regards himself as something more than the inquirer. By the very finality and absoluteness with which he has endowed the present, he has heightened his own position. For him, the voice of posterity is the voice of God, and the historian is the voice of posterity. And it is typical of him that he tends to regard himself as the judge when by his methods and his equipment he is fitted only to be the detective. His concern with the sphere of morality forms, in fact, the extreme point in his desire to make judgments of value and to count them as the verdict of history. By a curious example of the transference of ideas, he, like many other people, has come to confuse the importance which courts of legal justice must hold, and the finality they must have for practical reasons in society, with the most useless and unproductive of all forms of reflection, the dispensing of moral judgments upon people, or upon actions in retrospect. And it is interesting to see that the same mind and temper which induced the first act of self-aggrandizement tend quickly to lead to another one, which is unobtrusive, indefinite, unavowed. The assertiveness, which in the first place claimed the prerogatives of eternal justice, now proceeds by a similar logic to a more subtle form of encroachment. For the Whig historians have shown a propensity to heighten the coloring of their historical narrations by laying hold on some difference of opinion or some conflict of policies and claiming this as a moral issue. And indeed, it is a propensity which requires great self-discipline in any of us to resist. It must be remembered that there were some things in the past which the Whig is very anxious to condemn, and some of his views have a way of turning themselves into something like a moral code. There is at least a chance that the real burden of his indignation may fall on things which are anathema only to the Whigs. It is not an accident that he has shown a disinclination to see moral judgments removed from history. It might be true to say that in Lord Acton, the Whig historian reached his highest consciousness. And it is true, and at the same time, it is not a mere coincidence that in his writings moral judgments appeared in their most trenchant and uncompromising form, while in his whole estimate of the subject of the moral function of history was most greatly magnified. One may gather from his statements in this connection that he regarded this side of his thought as the consequence of his Catholicism. But one may question his self-analysis at this point, for it is difficult to see that either the actual content of his moral code, as it can be inferred from what might be called his judicial decisions, or the particular way in which he applied his principles to any case that was under consideration, could be regarded as representing a system that was specifically Catholic or Christian. It is not malicious to suggest that they should be put down rather to his bias as a Whig historian. When, in defense of his position, he made the remark that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, he may have been stating the wisest of truths, but we can suspect that it was a truth more dear to the heart of the liberal that there was in him than to the mind of the Roman Catholic. And though the thesis is one which might serve to excuse and explain as much as to condemn a historical personage, it is put forward with a hostile innuendo, It is given as the reason why no allowance is to be made for men in high places. Action refers with implied approval to a view of history which his theories really elaborate, and he describes this view as follows. It seems the canonization of the historic past more perilous than ignorance or denial, because it would perpetuate the reign of sin and acknowledge the sovereignty of wrong. It is curious, though it is not incomprehensible, that a professor should find it necessary to warn young historians against an excess of sympathy or appreciation for the historic past. But what is more interesting is the thorough Whig bias that is obvious, though latent, in the remark. Most illuminating of all would be to pursue, as it were possible, the connotations in the mind of the Whig historian of the words, the reign of sin, the sovereignty of wrong, particularly as they are flavored by the reference to the canonization of the past. Finally, in this, as in many more of Acton's theses, we find some sign of what is a common feature of Whig historians. There is the hint that for all this desire to pass moral judgments on various things in the past, it is really something in the present that the historian is most anxious about. Another statement of Acton's is interesting and is perhaps very acute. It is to the effect that much more evil is due to conscious sin and much less to unconscious error than most of us are actually aware. Though whatever its value may be, it can scarcely be regarded as a lesson of history, for it is an extreme example of the kind of truth that can only be reached by self-analysis. Coupled with another statement, it becomes extremely dangerous, for Acton, in his inaugural lecture, gives reasons why it is better that the sin should be presumed than that we should search too far for other explanations. There is a popular saying of Madame de Staël, he writes, that we forgive whatever we really understand. The paradox has been judiciously pruned by her descendant, the Duc de Broglie, in the words, "Beware of too much explaining, lest we end by too much excusing." Once again, the Whig theory of history has the practical effect of curtailing the effort of historical understanding. An undefined region is left to the subjective decision of the historian, in which he shall choose not to explain, but shall merely declare that there is sin. One can only feel that if a historian holds such a combination of theories, there must have been something in the past or the present which he very badly wanted to condemn. In fact, there is too much zest in the remark, "Suffer no man and no cause to escape the undying penalty which history has the power to inflict on wrong." The Whig historian, like Aquinas, if indeed it was Aquinas, may find perhaps too great comfort in the contemplation of some form of torment for the damned. But it would be unjust to Lord Acton to overlook the fact that behind his views on moral judgments there lies a more fundamental thesis. Acton held a very attractive theory concerning the moral function of history. It is perhaps the highest possible form of the Whig tendency to exalt historical study. To Bishop Crichton, Acton wrote that when the historian makes a compromise on the question of moral principles, history ceases to be an arbiter of controversy, the upholder of that moral standard which the powers of earth and religion itself tend constantly to depress. When history tampers with the moral code, it serves where it ought to reign. It is an attractive exaltation of history which gives it the power to bind and loosen, to be the arbiter of controversy, to reign and not to serve. But one may believe that it is a theory which takes too short a cut to the absolute. It is history encroaching, like the Hegelian state, till it becomes all-comprehensive, and stands as the finality in a moral world, taking custody of that moral standard which religion itself tends constantly to depress. It is history raised into something like the mind of God, making ultimate judgments upon the things which are happening in time. Here is the true Pope, that will not be servus servorum Dei. Here is the only absolutism that the Whig is disposed to defend. Here is divine right and non-resistance, for, if a word can be allowed in malice, is not history on the side of the Whigs? It is not easy to resist the temptation to personify and idealize history, and there is no doubt that this species of romancing has its effect upon the posture of the historian. In its practical consequence, it means the exaltation of the opinions of the historian. It reaches its highest point in the conception of history as the arbiter, history as the seat of judgment, particularly on moral issues. Lord Acton carried it to the extremity of its logical conclusion. Quote, "It is the office of historical science to maintain morality as the sole impartial criterion of men and things, to develop and perfect and arm conscience is the great achievement of history." End quote. Acton, however, did not exactly set out to defend the moral function of the historian against the unbeliever. He was concerned, rather, with the manner in which this function should be construed and the seriousness with which this duty should be carried out. He was attacking the historian, who, while taking for granted that moral judgments were part of his province, used his prerogatives to make easy exonerations and dealt loosely with the moral code. Much of his doctrine is a valid protest against the slipshod nature of the excuses that can be adduced by the historian, particularly when these excuses are mechanically applied to any given case. And he raises the serious question how far a historian's explanations, such as the reference to a man's upbringing or to the spirit of the age, can really exonerate an offender. For example, a pope in the 15th century of the Christian era. When all historical explanations of character and conduct have been exhausted, it must be remembered that the real moral question is still waiting to be solved. And what can the historian do about the secret recesses of the personality where a man's final moral responsibility resides? Acton sees the problem, but he merely says that in cases of doubt we should incline to severity. This is the meaning of his statement, that more evil is due to conscious sin and less is due to unconscious error than many people are aware. And this is why he can say, "Beware of too much explaining, lest we end by too much excusing." Granted that the historian has raised the moral question at all and has accepted the assumptions which the very raising of the question must imply, he must not then slide down from this lofty moral sphere and fall back into the terms of his own historical world, thereby easing off into a different set of assumptions altogether. And in particular, when he has given what is really only the historical explanation of character or conduct, he must not imagine that by this he has done anything to explain moral responsibility away. Acton puts his finger on the very center of the problem of moral judgments in history. He is unsatisfactory because he cannot answer it. At the crucial point, he can merely tell us to incline to severity. His attitude on this special question, therefore, really involves, as a fundamental thesis, better be unjust to dead men than give currency to loose ideas on questions of morals. It is, in fact, the reductio ad absurdum of moral judgments in history. Acton, by focusing attention upon the real problems of these moral judgments, came very near to providing us with the argument against having them at all. Our only refuge against the impossible dilemma and the impossible ideal which his theories present to us lies in the frank recognition of the fact that there are limits to what history and the historian can do. For the very thing with which they are concerned is the historical explanation of character and conduct, and if we distrust or discourage this kind of explanation, as even Acton seemed inclined to do, we are running perilously near to the thesis, better be unhistorical than do anything that may lower the moral dignity of history. The truth is that this historical explaining does not condemn, neither does it excuse. It does not even touch the realm in which words like these have meaning or relevance. It is compounded of observations made upon the events of the concrete world. It is neither more nor less than the process of seeing things in their context. True, it is not for the historian to exonerate, but neither is it for him to condemn. It greatly clears his mind if he can forgive all sins without denying that there are sins to forgive, but remembering that the problem of their sinfulness is not really a historical problem at all. And though it is certainly not in his competence to declare that moral responsibility does not exist, we may say that this responsibility lies altogether outside the particular world where the historian does historical thinking. He is faced with insuperable difficulties if he tries to stand with one foot in a world that is not his own. Granting, what is less easy than might appear, an agreement on points of morality, it is a subtle matter to find the incidence of these upon any particular case, and it must be remembered that moral judgments are by their very nature absolute, in the sense that it is pointless to make them unless one can claim definitely to be right. It may be easy for the moralist of the 20th century to discuss the ethics of persecution, to say, perhaps, that religious persecution would be wrong today, perhaps that it was wrong in all the ages. It may be easy to judge the thing, to condemn the act, but how shall the historian pass to the condemnation of people and apply his standards to the judgment of a special incident at any particular moment? Shall he say that in the 16th century all men are absolved because the age took persecution for granted and counted it a duty, or shall he condemn men for not being sufficiently original in their thoughts to rise above the rules and standards of their own day? Shall he condemn Mary Tudor as a persecutor and praise Catherine de Medici for seeking toleration? Or is it more true to say that Mary was fervent and consistent in her Catholicism, while Catherine was more worldly and indifferent? The historian's function is, in the first place, to describe the persecutions for which the English queen was responsible, and to narrate the attempts of the French queen to secure toleration. But because he has the art of sifting sources and weighing evidence, this does not mean that he has the subtlety to decide the incidence of moral blame or praise. He is the less a historian, certainly, if by any moral judgment he puts a stop to his imaginative endeavor, and if through moral indignation he cuts short the effort of historical understanding. Faced with the poisonings of which Alexander VI is accused, it is for the historian to be merely interested, merely curious to know how such things came to happen. It is his duty to show why Mary persecuted and why Catherine did not wish to, until it seems natural to us that the one should have done the one thing while the other acted differently. Perhaps in proportion as he sets out to show why a certain event took place and how a certain deed came to be done, he actually disarms our moral judgment and makes an end of the very impulse to moral indignation. By setting himself the task of explaining how Mary Tudor came to be what she was, he makes moral judgments, for the time being utterly irrelevant. The truth is that the historian, whose art is a descriptive one, does not move in this world of moral ideas. His materials and his processes and all his apparatus exist to enable him to show how a given event came to take place. Who is he to jump out of his true office and merely announce to us that it ought never to have happened at all? The complications to which the exercise of moral judgment may lead us are illustrated in the case of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon claimed that by his genius and by his destiny he was cut off from the moral world. He considered himself an exception to the usual rules concerning right and wrong, and seems to have been conscious that he was a strange creature fallen among the habitations of men, a completely amoral person, walking with the indifference of a blind force in nature, something like an avalanche that had crashed upon the world. It is true that he was not indifferent to morality in other people. It was almost his vocation to restore a moral order that had collapsed in the Revolution, to discipline society again, and to bring back the decencies of life. But this was consistent with his claim to be outside the moral order, because he considered that he himself was, so to speak, the moral end, as the Hegelian state claims to be. He believed that it was in serving him that other men attained their own good. All that he did in his own interests he could count as done for the glory of France. All that endangered his position was a menace to the state. His situation and his power combined with his instinct to make him avowedly the amoral man. When a person has so completely stated his own outlawry from the moral order, it is tautology for a historian to do anything but describe his own view of himself. It is either redundant or it is extremely subtle to discuss the morality of a man who does not admit the moral order, or regards himself as an exception to its laws. And when a man has so completely stated his whole position, it is not very useful to go on to discuss whether any particular deed of his must be considered immoral. If he claims to be outside morality, it is much more relevant to study his errors. For when a man says that he himself is the state, it is essential that he should not make mistakes. If the execution of the Duc d'Orléans was necessary for the maintenance of Napoleon's government, one might argue that it was necessary for the stability and the peace of France. And in this case, it raises the tangled question of what one may do to ensure the safety of the state. But if Napoleon were mistaken, and if the execution was not necessary for that purpose, then the error itself was immorality, and it is not mere callous indifference to say that the mistake was worse than a crime. But moral judgments are useless unless they can be taken to imply a comparison of one man with another. Otherwise, the historian would have to fall flat with the commonplace that all men are sinners sometimes. At the same time, it is impossible to make comparisons of this kind unless we compare also the situation in which men find themselves, the urgency of their position, the purposes for which they were working, the demands which they were willing to make upon themselves at the time when they made their claims on others. It is difficult again to judge a man like Napoleon, who stood, so to speak, in the free air, and had the power to do what he liked. No government controlled his actions. No law or police kept him within the rails. No institutions set the limiting conditions for his moral behavior. No fear of social disapproval held him back. All the forces which curb the selfishness of all of us, and the circumstances which even limit our desires, were, so to speak, beneath his hand, and left him free and unconditioned. It is impossible for us even to imagine a man whose situation and power leave him free to choose his conduct and let loose desire, free to do with other men as he pleases. We do not know that the Prussian king would have been more moderate in his ambitions if he had had the power to carry them out and the chance ever to make free play with his mind. And we do not know that we, who, because of our circumstances, have small desires and 1,000 automatic repressions of desire, would have been more respectable than he in our lives if we had been in a position to range over the whole universe of desire. We know indeed that this man, whose mind was in some ways so unbridled, did not live without performing upon himself what were marvels of self-discipline. This is not a defense of Napoleon, who knew that his career was a scourge to the whole continent. And these things do not eliminate the moral responsibility upon which Lord Acton set such a store. But they do show that Napoleon is not to the historian the object of a simple and absolute moral judgment. They make it necessary for us to translate the whole question into terms with which the historian is competent to deal. We are in a world that is the historian's own if we say that the character of Napoleon is to him the subject of a piece of description. It is not his function to tease himself with questions concerning the place where moral responsibility resides, concerning the extent to which ends justify means, and good causes cover wicked actions, or concerning the degree to which a man may go in Machiavellianism to save perhaps the very existence of a state. But he can give evidence that Napoleon lied, that Alexander VI poisoned people, and that Mary Tudor persecuted. And to say that one man was a coward, or another man a fanatic, or a certain person was an habitual drunkard, may be as valid as any other historical generalization. The description of a man's characteristics, the analysis of a mind and a personality, are, subject to obvious limits, part of the whole realm of historical interpretation. For it is the assumption of historical study that by sympathy and insight and imagination, we can go at least some way toward the understanding of people other than ourselves, and times other than our own. Further, the historian may concern himself with the problems which seems to have troubled Lord Acton, the effect which the promulgation of slipshod ideas on moral questions may have had at any time upon human conduct. The historian is on his own ground again when he inquires into the consequences, at certain periods in the past, of various forms of the doctrine that the end justifies the means, or when he shows the historical importance of various ethical theories that concern the state. When Acton asserts that there has been little progress in ethics between St. John and the Victorian era, he may be right or wrong, but he is making what we call a historical statement. Ethical questions concern the historian insofar as they are part of the world which he has to describe. Ethical principles and ideals concern him only in the effect that they have had on human beings. In other words, he deals with morality insofar as it is a part of history. If morality is the product of history, the historian may be called upon to describe its development. If it is an absolute system, equally binding on all places at all times, then it does not concern him, for his apparatus only allows him to examine the changes of things which change. But even in this case, it is only the form of the question which is required to be restated. He will be driven now to watch the story of men's growing consciousness of the moral order, or even gradual discovery of it. Morality, even though it be absolute, is not absolute to him. Taking the broad history of centuries, it is possible to watch the evolution of constitutional government and religious liberty, and one may see this evolution as the cooperative achievement of all humanity, Whig and Tory assisting in spite of themselves, Protestant and Catholic both necessary to the process, the principles of order and liberty making perpetual interaction, and, on both sides of the great controversies, men fighting one another who were considered good in their day, and who, to the historian, are at any rate irreproachable in their private lives. But if the historian is prepared to discriminate between the purposes for which well-meaning men fought one another, and if he is prepared to see the issue as a moral issue and make it a matter for an absolute judgment, if he insists that it is his business to treat his subject in a realm of moral ideas, he will certainly find a shorter cut to whatever purpose he is working for, and his history will be written in stronger lines, for it will be a form of the Whig over-dramatization. He may then hold liberty and constitutional government as issues in the perennial clash of the principles of good and evil. He may make ancient quarrels his own, and set humanity forever asunder, and judging the past by the present, keep all generations forever apart. And it has happened that he has been able to admit that there were good men on both sides of the great conflict, but to do it without making the least sacrifice of what must be regarded as the luxury and pleasing sensuousness of moral indignation. Behind everything, and notwithstanding something like a cosmic scheme of good and evil in conflict, the Whig historian has found it possible to reserve for himself one last curious piece of subtlety. He can choose even to forgive the private life of Fox, and save his moral condemnation for the repressive policy of Pitt. For, of Lord Acton himself, we are informed that, quote, he had little desire to pry into the private morality of kings and politicians, end quote. And it was Acton who told historians that they must, quote, suspect power more than vice, end quote. The Whig seems to prefer to take his moral stand upon what he calls the larger questions of public policy. So upon the Whig interpretation of history, we have imposed the peculiar historian's ethics, by which we can overlook the fact that a king is a spendthrift and a rake, but cannot contain our moral passions if a king has too exalted a view of his own office. Burke's dictum, which Acton endorses, that, quote, the principles of true politics are those of morality enlarged, end quote, may contain a world of truth, but it can be dangerous in the hands of the historian. And not the least of its dangers lies in the fact that it can be so easily inverted. The historian presents us with the picture of the world as it is in history. He describes to us the whole process that underlies the changes of things which change. He offers this as an explanation, his peculiar contribution to our knowledge of ourselves and of human affairs. It represents his own special mode of thought, which has laws of its own and is limited by his apparatus. If he postures good against evil, if he talks of the reign of sin, the sovereignty of wrong, he sets all the angles of his picture differently, for he sets them by measurements which really come from another sphere. If he deals in moral judgments at all, he is trying to take upon himself a new dimension, and he is leaving that realm of historical explanation which is the only one he can call his own. So we must say of him that it is his duty to show how men came to differ, rather than to tell a story which is meant to reveal who is in the right. It must be remembered that, by merely inquiring and explaining, he is increasing human understanding, extending it to all the ages, and binding the world into one. And in this, rather than in the work of perfecting and arming conscience, we must seek the achievement and the function and the defense of history. Finally, against Acton's view that history is the arbiter of controversy, the monarch of all she surveys, it may be suggested that she is the very servant of the servants of God, the drudge of all the drudges. The historian ministers to the economist, the politician, the diplomat, the musician. He is equally at the service of the strategist and the ecclesiastic, and the administrator. He must learn a great deal from all of these before he can begin even his own work of historical explanation, and he never has the right to dictate to any one of them. He is neither judge nor jury. He is in the position of a man called upon to give evidence, and even so he may abuse his office, and he requires the closest cross-examination, for he is one of those expert witnesses who persist in offering opinions concealed within their evidence. Perhaps all history books hold a danger for those who do not know a great deal of history already. In any case, it is never safe to forget the truth, which really underlies historical research. The truth that all history perpetually requires to be corrected by more history. When everything has been said, if we have not understanding, the history of all the ages may bring us no benefit, for it may only give us a larger canvas for our smudging, a wider world for our willfulness. History is all things to all men. She is at the service of good causes and bad. In other words, she is a harlot and a hireling, and for this reason she best serves those who suspect her most. Therefore, we must beware even of saying, history says, or history proves, as though she herself were the oracle, as though indeed history, once she had spoken, had put the matter beyond the range of mere human inquiry. Rather, we must say to ourselves, she will lie to us to the very end of the last cross-examination. This is the goddess the Whig worships when he claims to make her the arbiter of controversy. She cheats us with optical illusions, sleight of hand, equivocal phraseology. If we must confuse counsel by personifying history at all, it is best to treat her as an old reprobate whose tricks and juggleries are things to be guarded against. In other words, the truth of history is no simple matter, all packed and parceled, ready for handling in the marketplace. And the understanding of the past is not so easy as it is sometimes made to appear. This is the end of Herbert Butterfield's Whig interpretation of history. This book was read by George Bagby. If you have enjoyed this free audiobook posted on YouTube and other media, please consider buying me a coffee. Go to my YouTube page and look for the link. I much appreciate your support.